Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. In this episode of the Engineering Manager series, Augustus and I spoke to Pankaj Risbood, who is the co-founder and CTO of Zendrive. Zendrive has raised about 57 million in funding to build cutting-edge technology and apps that can make roads safer. Pankaj is a Google and IISc alum, and he has spent about 2 decades building high-performance engineering teams. He spoke about principles that he utilizes to make engineering decisions, how he builds a culture of curiosity and perseverance in his teams, structuring engineering pods as the startup scales from 5 or 10 people to a few hundred, and then getting all of these people to collaborate meaningfully to solve for the customer. This is another fascinating conversation, and I hope you like it. Hey Pankaj, welcome to the Startup Operator podcast.
Thank you, Rohan, and thank you, Augustus, for having me here. It's great to be with you guys and talking about startups.
Awesome. So maybe to begin things, if you could just share a brief profile of yourself, what you've done before and what you're doing right now.
Sure. So I'm co-founder and CTO at a company called Zendrive. This is a company I founded with my very good friend, Jonathan. We are about 7 years into existence. Series B plus at this point in time. We are US plus Bangalore based startup. So my co-founder is based in San Francisco. I'm based in Bangalore. And then we together kind of run this two-body problem. We're a team of about 125, 130 people at this point. Prior to starting Zendrive, I have had 3 different places I've worked. I was a director of engineering at Walmart Labs. Prior to that, I had a fairly long stint, about 6 years at Google, where I was building speech recognition software, and Google Compute Engine was some of the early things that I worked on. And that's actually where I met my co-founder, Jonathan, as well. So that was an added bonus. Prior to Google, I had a stint for another 6 years at Bell Labs in US. I was in New Jersey. There I was working more as a researcher. I was part of the optical networking group, and my focus was, as a researcher, was more around writing patents, building IPs, building prototypes, and bringing essentially new technology out. Apart from that, I'm a product of IISc right here in Bangalore. So I graduated from computer science department back in year 2000. I'm from Madhya Pradesh, Ujjain otherwise, and now living in Bangalore for the last 15 years.
Fantastic. So if you look at all of the various stints that you've done in your career, what is the common underlying thread? What is the kind of problems that you're most excited to solve?
It's been about 20 years. I've touched upon a few, variety of problems, but I would say over the last 15 odd years, if you look at the thread that's running through, is really solving large scale data problems, problems that require big, massive scale, problems that are at the where learning from data, machine learning, data science becomes a big part of the overall solution. So those are the nature of problems. If, let's say, for example, you look at speech recognition, right? I mean, that's a core data sciencey problem, trying to understand, trying to transcribe spoken sentence into text, whether it is in the form of a query, as in, say, let's say a Google search by voice kind of thing, or transcribing, example, the video that we are recording right now, right? Similarly, what we do at Zendrive, it's really all about understanding driving behavior using smartphone sensor data. So we are looking at massive time series data to figure out different behaviors that people exhibit while driving, whether they are aggressive on the road, whether they are distracted. So it's really handling large amount of data and then making sense of that data to solve real world problems.
Right. So, almost every startup claims to have some amount of AI, ML, use cases, right, as such. So, what are the use cases that actually merit AI ML? Is it like some kind of large scale data, as you mentioned, or any other? Typically, what lends itself into these kind of use cases or the application of AI ML?
Sure. Again, sort of, if you think from a very basic perspective, and the purpose of any software is to bring in some kind of an automation, right? Solve a problem in an automated manner where a human doesn't need to be involved, right? And now there are certain types of things that you can do as a software with specific rules, right? So here is a rule for how the database entries are made, or sort of a customer has these kinds of information associated with them, and so on. And that's kind of more the standard programmatic logic of saying sort of how do you capture the business logic or relationships into the code itself. But then once you get from those kinds of problems to problems that are sort of more fuzzy in nature, let's take as an example, let's go back to speech recognition, right? There is no one rule that says this is how you transcribe a particular word into sort of text. Different people can say the same thing in variety of different ways. The way I say it would be very different from potentially from the way you say it, would be very different from let's say somebody who's an American would say it, or a Britisher would say it. So there is lots of accents coming in. There is lots of background noise coming in. If my children keep running in from behind, suddenly sort of that noise will also get mixed into it. And now suddenly you're talking about a problem where there's so many of these variables, and yet you can think about, so you can't really write a rule. But what you're saying is now, hey, if I have lots and lots and lots of data potentially of this type, where I have these utterances recorded, and let's say I have corresponding text for that, then I can build models for that. And those models could be sort of, let's say, deep learning is a common technique. So I'm building kind of like neural net models that are able to understand sort of, how that input gets converted into the corresponding output. And so I'm not really giving any specific rules to this system to say this is how you do it, but rather giving lots of examples. And this is how humans learn, right? I mean, as a kid, you see examples of, lots of sort of animals, and then you start recognizing, oh, that one is a cat, that one is a dog. And in the same way, sort of, here you are feeding lots and lots of these examples to your software. And then, the software is tuned to learn and decipher what is what. And, that typically becomes like a classification problem to sort of, figure out a YouTube video has a cat or a dog in it, right? Or whether the person said yes or no, or whether sort of, somebody applied hard brake or not while they were driving. So these are all problems where there are no specific rules that you can give to the software, but rather the software is figuring out the rules on the fly and actually learning through the process.
Right.
Those are the type of problems where artificial intelligence, machine learning is typically applicable and useful.
Right. So if you look at this episode is brought to you by Mulya. You want to move fast? Sure. But without breaking things? Now that's a hard ask. The thing is, once you have some base of users and customers, you just cannot afford to risk quality. So how do the likes of Cred, Swiggy and Curefit, some of India's fastest growing startups, ship at lightning pace and delight their users and customers? Simple, they're working with Mulya as a strategic quality partner. Mulya is India's most talented and passionate community of testers. They've helped prevent thousands of bugs and regression issues. So as a CTO or a product owner, if you want to reduce tech debt, especially while you scale, do check out Mulya.com. I've interviewed Mulya's founder and CEO Pradeep on the podcast earlier, and we spoke about how startups can improve quality while scaling and things to that effect. You should definitely check it out. I'll link to it in the description below. Now back to your regular programming. So if you look at the typical expectations of an engineer today, right, in terms of the skill set and even the kind of work that he or she is expected to do, a lot of things are, sort of collapsing, right? I mean, the person has to have a product mindset and think from a customer, and as you described, I mean, he or she must have some amount of data science capabilities, and then aside from that, I mean, obviously, be proficient in all of the coding as well, right? I mean, whatever code the person is supposed to deploy and in ship product and whatever. So, given that context, what makes an ideal engineer today, according to you?
Okay. I mean, look, it's actually not about today. It's really, I mean, the basic things never change, right? In some ways, and they remain sort of, constant throughout. You go back to sort of, the automobile engineers 20, 50 years ago, and sort of, the same kind of things would probably emerge, right? I mean, the things that matter, at least to me, sort of, what I look for are curiosity, right? Somebody who wants to understand why certain things are happening, why this stuff works this way, why that works that way, why it's not working, what's changing, if I change this, what happens, right? So having that kind of a curiosity is probably, I would say, the most basic, the most essential thing.
Yeah.
Be able to tinker with stuff, right? You want an experimenter, right? You want somebody who is not just an armchair, a mathematician or a philosopher, right, thinking about stuff. No, you want to tinker, you want to experiment with, try things out, see what works. Maybe this approach won't work, something else will work. I'll give it a try always, right? Being resourceful, that's probably another thing I would say, and I don't think this just applies to engineers, in anybody who is going to excel in some way, sort of, in whatever field that they choose, some of these things are kind of sort of, more essential. Being resourceful, for example, right?
Yeah.
You are not going to know everything. You will always have to rely on others, find things that are beyond sort of, your scope. And, whether it is finding right resources on the web, right, things to learn from, right people to associate with, sometimes just asking others for help, right? I mean, those are all things, you cannot get stuck for too long. Having, and again, these are all personality traits. So I'm talking less about skills and more about, traits,
Yeah.
because that's what matters a lot more. Having grit, you are writing a piece of code and you're constantly getting sort of, errors. You cannot give up, right? Having that perseverance, having that grit, that I will dive deeper and figure out what's going on here. And only through that process, you actually sort of, build experience, build expertise, so that next time you don't make the same mistakes. Maybe you make another mistake, a different mistake. And over time, sort of, if you have made large number of mistakes, you become good at it, because now you're not repeating those. So, the number of newer mistakes are lesser, and your output is much better, right?
Right.
So those are the kind of things I think about for a good engineer. If you become somebody a bit more senior, right, into the space, then few things change somewhat, right? I mean, these things, what I described so far, are equally essential, but as you become more senior, becoming more, and this probably comes with experience, sort of, becoming more pragmatic, right? Not saying I need to have the ideal solution always, but I need to have a solution that works for this problem here and now, and I can move on and I can learn and iterate from there, right? So having that, the cliche of sort of, done is better than perfect, kind of, right? But there is a lot of merit to that, right? Having a business understanding, you're not just solving a problem in isolation. A lot of engineers fall into that trap where this is my technical problem and this is what I want to do. But what's going to take you further on is really having that understanding. Why is this essential for business? Why would somebody pay for it? What is important, and what are the aspects of that solution that I'm creating that are more valuable versus others? Being able to prioritize. There are always 100 things to do for every single one of us. And even as an engineer, even when you are thinking about writing code, there are 50 things that you could do. But having that prioritization, having that understanding of, hey, what's 80-20? What's the sort of 20% effort that's going to give me that 80% result? And that's what I really want to go for. I think those are the things that makes a good engineer, in my view.
Fantastic. More than a couple of things I want to drill down on, right? One is, how do you build that engineering culture? Because all of what you mentioned, right, curiosity, perseverance, etc., now these are not things that you can learn from a course or you can put down in a process. So how does a team develop this culture, and how do you as an engineering leader sort of reinforce this culture?
Sure. Uh, Culture is always very amorphous. It's sort of, it's a thing that's hard to capture and hard to sort of, put in words many times. But it is probably the most important thing in some ways, sort of, when you think about an organization or a team, right? And a lot of it really comes from the leadership, right? How leaders operate, behave, how do they manage things, translates into everybody else sort of starting to do things in the same way, and then that becomes the template or the manifesto sort of that the rest of the organization follows and continues to follow from that point on, right? So you know for example, and if you want your teams to be curious, and if you want them to be sort of experimenting and tinkering with stuff, as a leader, if you reprimand every failure, that's not going to get that kind of an outcome,
Yeah.
right? You have to be comfort, because the very essence of experimentation and having that curiosity is sometimes you will land on a wrong path and it will fail, right? And so it's okay, telling your team and sort of demonstrating that it's okay to fail at times, right? Because you took a risk, you went down a path and it didn't work out, and that's fine. That's how you build a culture, because then you are demonstrating that, hey, we are actually encouraging this kind of a behavior. We are actually encouraging people to try different things, and we fully understand that some of those are going to fail, right? When you talk about things like perseverance, right? How does your how do you recognize people within your organization, right? Are you recognizing people for sort of the impact that they are having to your business, to whatever that thing is, right? And it doesn't have to be just about engineering. It doesn't have to be about sort of a specific domain. It's across the board. But are you recognizing people for and calling out people for sort of contributions that they are making, and handling difficult situations? Hey, we had an outage, or we had a situation that could have led to an outage, but this team or this person really sort of stuck it out and delivered stuff and really prevented sort of company from having a significant challenge or an issue. Recognize that, call that out, talk about it. Do in the spirit of learning, sort of learning is another thing that you want to be part of your culture. But how do you get that learning thing going? People are not just going to say, oh, learning is part of culture, so we are all going to learn. No, you have to put in some mechanisms and some processes into place, right? So take as an example saying, hey, we do retrospectives, right? We don't do postmortems happen on dead bodies. Right? So what it means is, it doesn't matter if things go bad or things go good. We always have a process where we sit down at the end of that execution of that process and say what worked, what didn't work, and what was surprising. And you follow that process always, no matter what. It was a great success, you will still do that. You will still find out what things didn't work, even if it was a great success. And when it was an absolute catastrophe, you will still find out and write down what were the things that still worked even during this catastrophe. Right? So it becomes a part of a process, and then people understand, hey, this is the part of the sort of the organization where, good or bad, we are always learning from it. We follow this process. It's not about a witch hunt that we are trying to find to put a blame on someone that, hey, this thing failed because so and so didn't do something right. No, it's a process that we always follow, and then we are learning, and then slowly sort of people start to embody that recognize that, and say, yes, that's what the organization is all about, and then we do it that way. So I'm just giving you sort of few examples of different elements of sort of culture that you want, and it really starts from leadership, sort of how you do things, and then how that translates. And having stuff written down, having always helps. Once you grow into a bigger organization, let's say you are when you're 5, 10, 20 people, they have a direct view of the leadership, right? So it's easy because you can see what your founder is doing, and you could emulate that, understand sort of that's the way things are going to be. When you're 100 plus people, that visibility may not be there always for all the people, right? So then you may have to sort of codify some of these things, write some of these things down, make it into processes, and that's an interesting journey again, sort of going from that few people to few tens to few hundred people kind of a thing. But everything always starts from what leadership believes in and sees as important, and then translates it into everybody else.
Right. So another interesting thing that you mentioned earlier was recognizing that there are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs, right?
Yes.
And I'm sure, I mean, you must be making these trade-offs on a daily basis. Any principles that you follow to sort of make these trade-offs? I know it's a very broad question and it's extremely contextual, but anything that you could talk about that could be useful for the audience?
Yeah, again, I'll probably phrase it a little bit. I would sort of bring it to decision making, right? Because everything that you are doing is you're making some kind of a decision, right? Do this, don't do this, do it this way, don't do it this way, do something else, kind of, right? And I think what is important to recognize is to say that, hey, every decision that you're going to make, it's the quality of decision that matters. The quality of outcome can depend on a lot of other things that may or may not be in your control always, right?
Yeah,
but
great
whether
point.
you are making the right decision, whether and then sort of you start thinking about a few core principles. Hey, we want to be data driven, right? As much as possible. Again, it's not to say that if I don't have the data, I won't make a decision, because you may not have that luxury, right?
Yeah.
But as to the extent possible, I will seek out data so that I can use that data to drive the decision to the best extent possible. Where I don't have the data, of course, you have to rely on your experience and gut call and whatever, but then you are seeking data. You want yourself and your people within your organization to also be people who have strong opinions, because many times sort of in a startup journey, you really don't have data. At that point in time, people with strong conviction are the ones sort of who take you in a certain direction, and so you need people with that conviction. But what's equally important for me is to say people have strong opinions, but those opinions are loosely held. Right? What that means is tomorrow, if a new set of data shows up or a new thing shows up that contradicts what you thought was going to be true, then you are not stuck on that thing saying, oh, I made this decision, so it's my decision, so now my ego is on the line, right? It doesn't matter. It's just a decision that was made, and now the data is showing otherwise. So let's go back. Let's redo this thing, right? And that's sort of in some ways central to using data, using insights, using experience, and then being open to sort of changing it when required as well. Another thing is sort of knowing how high the stakes are, right? Whether you are playing sort of on a $5 table, or you're playing on $1 million table, right? Because the impact of sort of decision panning out wrong, or sort of not working out, is very, very different, right? If you make a decision that is fatal to your startup, right, you do it wrong, and you may literally have to shut down your company, then the stakes are very, very high. At that point in time, you want to deliberate a lot more, maybe wait for a little bit more data, maybe talk to 3 more people. So a bit more deliberation is called for at that point in time, but only because the stakes are so high. If you are making a small decision, which is not too big a deal, easily reversible, if you make it wrong, you can always come back to it and sort of say, yeah, we made a mistake, not a big deal, let's do it again. Okay, optimize for speed at that point in time, because the more deliberation you are going to do is just going to delay you from sort of making progress. Speed is the name of the game at that point in time. So that's the kind of trade-off in some ways. Sort of many times you can either go for one extent analysis paralysis, other extent no regard for sort of data and stuff, just make a decision. And You have to know where you are playing, and then what makes most sense to do. Whether you should be more cautious, whether you should be more optimizing for speed. Uh, Listen to experts, but know sort of uh, what you know about the problem as well. Sometimes you will have a person in your team who claims to be an expert and sort of has a certain opinion, uh, but don't go with that opinion just like that, because they may be coming from their own biases, right? And so it's always better to have a challenge, ask the right questions, kick the tires and see if it will still hold, nothing falls off. Okay, you are sort of ready to make that decision. So yeah, I mean, there isn't like a formula, right? But there are all these different sort of nuggets that you look at and say, okay, I should be careful about some of these things as I'm making decisions, and sort of move forward from there.
Right. So, in your current role as CTO at Zendrive, what are some high level challenges that you're solving?
Uh, Quite a few, right? I mean, as a founder, sort of whichever stage of the company you are in, there are always sort of issues and challenges that are sort of showing up. Uh, like I mentioned, today we are a company of sort of 100 plus people, and when you look at sort of something like a startup at this kind of a stage, uh, you know. Setting up processes, setting up systems becomes a lot more important. Uh, Earlier stage of the company, the emphasis is a lot more on speed. You want to move faster because there is not much to lose. You're sort of putting stuff out there, getting your customers to try. Now that you have few big large customers who are sort of very much dependent on the product that you are delivering, emphasis on quality becomes really important. How do you make sure sort of the stuff is being delivered with the right quality bar that your customers expect? Um, how do you stuff we talked about around sort of the culture of the company and translating that, particularly in current environment, we are all remote, right? uh, how do you get a new guy joining the company and still being able to understand this is how the company operates, this is what the expectations are, this is what I should be doing? There is, yeah, I mean, all of us, and I'm still learning, I would say, sort of on how to operate this. As a company, we have found sort of for example, efficiency and productivity was easier to obtain when all of us went remote, right? Because it's like, hey, you got to do this. Okay, people are focused, they are working from home, not a lot of distractions, hopefully they can get it done. But then how do you bring in empathy? How do you bring in empathy for not just for your team, but for the customer, for your stakeholders? How do you get that communication flowing? How do you make sure there is transparency in the system? How do you if there are sort of certain changes being done, how do those get communicated sort of seamlessly throughout the organization? So those are typically things that you would deal with in any organization that's growing from sort of 10, 20, 50 to sort of 100, 200 kind of a scale in terms of number of people. It makes it, being remote makes it an order of magnitude more challenging now, because you're not physically there. So sort of a lot of nuances that you simply observe and are able to correct for don't exist anymore. So systems, processes become that much more important in some ways, sort of to do that. Other kind of challenges are, of course, sort of COVID sort of change business environment. So sort of how do you work in this new environment? Luckily, things are moving far better right now, and so sort of there is huge positivity in the market space. So that's great. Uh, but yeah, I mean, those are the kind of sort of challenges. Growth is another one, right? How do you hire the right leaders for the organization to take to the next level?
Right.
What kind of people you bring in? What kind of, not just skills, but temperament and attitude they bring to the table? Um, so those are all the things that are important and sort of things that occupy my mind space right now in terms of sort of various things that I need to think about.
Right. So when you go from C to Series A to Series B and beyond, right? I mean, you're essentially going from, let's say, one pod for everything to many different pods for many different things, and it's easy for things to get siloed, right? So how do you keep that collaborative environment going, and essentially how do you structure an engineering team to sort of let them function independently but yet collaborate on certain things and move forward? So when you go from, let's say, a 5 or 10 to 100-member engineering team, right? Any sort of tips or tricks or things that have worked for you?
Sure. And it's always an evolving learning process for every organization, right? So I would tell you things that we have done, not perfectly. There are always sort of things we didn't do right and we learned from it. But a different organization which has a different pace of growth may do it very differently also. So there isn't like a one way of doing it. There are potentially multiple, but few things sort of remain the same. And it again boils down to sort of a team, because a team is focused on a specific problem, sort of doing things. And typically a team is not 100 people. A team is 5 to 10 people max, right? 10 to 12 is probably the maximum size that you're going to go to. And so really in some ways you're optimizing for how to make that unit function most effectively, because if you can make that unit function most effectively and replicate that multiple times, then you have got the thing going, right? Of course you have to still work on some of the glue pieces across teams and sort of communication and all that, but the most important piece is that team structure has to work very, very well, right? And really in this sort of space, at least the way we have thought about is the three things that we care most about is, and I think this is a well-known, I'm forgetting the name of the author, but what we call autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right? Those three things put together really sort of should be there for a team. The team should be autonomous, so that they are able to make their decisions. If they are for every decision, either they have to go up or go sideways, it's not going to work, right? The people within the team should feel that autonomy, that they are responsible for it, and then they also have the ownership to sort of make the decision that they need to. Mastery is sort of enabling them to grow up and up in their sort of whatever their progression in terms of growth is, right? For an engineer, it's going from just writing code to doing complex system designs. For a tech lead, to going from sort of just running sort of sprints to doing overall planning and so on. But everybody feels within the team that they are developing mastery over their trade, whatever that trade is, and they are constantly growing in that. And then purpose is, every team has a very strong reason for existence. Why do they exist? What is the thing that they are making different, right? How are they impacting the customer? They have a proper roadmap for themselves so that they know this is the sort of the direction that we are going into, that we are working towards. So if you can set that appropriately and then put a solid leader in place, then you can have a team sort of function more or less independently. What's needed after that are, from a leadership perspective, are things like transparency. You want to give people as much transparency as possible so that they don't feel like, oh, I'm sitting in a silo and I don't know what else is going on, right? You want to make information flow as easily available as possible. These days tools are quite a few. Slack is pretty much ubiquitous across every organization, but creating again that element that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to sort of go across and ask questions, and people are free to. Nobody feels like like just because I ask question, that means people think I don't know something. No, it's just I need to know, and that's why I'm asking. And nobody feels like if I give a wrong answer or if I don't know something, then that's also creating a challenge. It's just a free culture of learning that way. Um, other things sort of an organization perspective are sort of from a at a company level, sort of, again, having that similar kind of vision and clarity. What is the direction as a company we are headed in? What are we doing? What are we doing different? Why will we succeed? What are the milestones that we have? So that every team understands their own stuff, but also understands how their stuff aligns with the broader company's vision and mission, right? And if you can get that alignment going, I think you are on a pretty good path to sort of take things happen. That's how I sort of approach it.
So one of the things in this whole structuring of the teams and the company is also to have the right expectations at the right levels, right? So I've often wondered, what is the right expectation to have from, let's say, a tech lead, an engineering manager, let's say a VP of engineering and a CTO. So how does what is the right expectation from each of these roles in your opinion?
Okay. Again, sorry, I'll keep giving you these answers, which always say, there is no one way of doing things.
No, of course.
Right? Because there isn't, right? I mean, if there is a tech lead who is sort of, taking on a lot more ownership and responsibility, I will give them a lot more ownership and responsibility, far above sort of, what I may expect from a typical tech lead. Because if somebody is motivated and driven to do certain things, that's great.
Right.
You want to give them, you want to keep them always on that curve where their capabilities, there is a small gap between what is expected of them and their capabilities. So they're always striving for higher and higher and higher and so on. Right? But coming back to your question, sort of, if you think about a tech lead, right, then we talked in the earlier question, we talked about sort of what's expected from an engineer, or what makes a good engineer really, right? You take the parts that are more about the somebody who is a senior level engineer, having a empathy for customer, having a empathy for stakeholders, because there are other people dependent on your team's outcome, having a sense of sort of discipline, if you will, because as junior engineers, you could be stuck on solving a problem forever, but as a tech lead, the expectation is sort of you are thinking about, hey, this is the estimation, this is the timeline that we are running through, and being disciplined about that, understanding when we are overshooting those timelines, making sure sort of you can bring it in, rein it in when required, you can reduce the scope if required, sort of so that you can still deliver things on time at times. Being able to run basic processes like your sprint planning, managing your sprint boards, Kanban boards, and knowing sort of what is the velocity that the team is operating in it, what is it capable of, and bringing out those data points up front. So those are the kinds of things that you expect from a tech lead. Again, technology ownership is important. So being able to provide technical direction, right? Taking a larger problem, breaking it down into smaller pieces and saying, okay, this is how the overall design is going to look like. Now, this particular piece, I can chunk it off and give off to a junior engineer to sort of, go and run on their own. So that's what you would expect. When you think about an engineering manager, it's kind of a one step above from there. All of these things that we just talked about are definitely there and definitely important. But as you go to engineering manager, ability and willingness to lead becomes critical, right? Now, this is the first level at which you are being given that true responsibility, where you are leading a group of people, right? And as we grow up through our schooling system, nobody is ever taught how to lead, right? And so we are only looking at other people and figuring it out and sort of doing that. And so you need that willingness, you need that desire to say, no, I want to be that leader. It's going to be uncomfortable at times, but I'm willing to go through that bit of a discomfort and actually try that. Ability to delegate. Sometimes I see people who are solid engineers can do 10 people's work, but that's not what's required. What's required is to get 10 people to do the work, right? Which means you have to delegate that work to them so that you can sort of work on more important problems, right? And that's a challenge, and I see that challenge quite a bit, particularly amongst engineers who are very good at their craft. Being able to cross that chasm is sort of sometimes difficult for them, right? uh, Being able to simplify things, often junior to mid-level engineers like complexity, right? Because it's the way for them to say, oh, I'm solving a more complex problem, more
Correct.
bigger problem, that's the way sort of you would think about it. But as a leader, as a manager, the goal is to not say you're solving let's simplify the problem, because the more simpler you think about it, the more the solution that will come out will be more robust, more scalable, uh, more maintainable over time, right? These are the things that a junior engineer is unlikely to think about at any point in time. How is this maintainable? Can this survive for the next 3 years, right? And are we putting in the right processes? Do we have unit testing? Do we have code coverage in our system? Are our code reviews happening on time, right? These are the things that a tech lead plus sort of engineering manager has to worry a lot more about, to say, yes, these basic sanity and basic processes that make an efficient engineering team are alive and well within my team, and I'm running those appropriately, right? So that becomes important. When you add the element of people management to it, that adds another dimension sort of for the first level engineering manager, because then you're not only talking about technology, you're starting to talk about people. And as the one of the VP engineering at Google when I was there used to say, technology is easy, people are hard. Right? And that's so very true, right? Because now it's not just about solving a problem, it's actually trying to understand what's the motivation of this engineer, what would get him to solve this problem in the appropriate manner, right? What are the things that they care about, and how do I attach this work to that intrinsic motivation? How do I get the best out of this person? Being committed to their growth. It becomes less about me and my deliverables, but it's a lot more about, hey, this person, are they learning, are they growing, are they evolving in their career? And some ways, sometimes very good engineers, extremely good engineers, don't make good managers, and that's
I
prime.
think that's exactly what I was about to ask you. So, what
Right?
I've seen over my experiences is that I've seen that there are some. I would say there is a person of this engineer that does not make that shift. The
Correct.
things that you mentioned, people management, and you mentioned things like deliverables. You mentioned things like balancing, business requirements, and then there's technical expertise. I think that there is like, so something which I wanted to ask you is, I think there may be a need for us to rethink the hierarchy of how engineering is done in today's teams to some extent,
Oh,
so that
so
we
so
give
absolutely.
these guys or these programmers a way to, like, I don't know,
Yeah,
progress in their career without really making that switch,
absolutely.
I know people who don't want to make that switch, but who want to keep improving in whatever
Yes.
technical area that
And
they're good
you're
at.
absolutely right. And that's something we do at Zendrive. And I believe I've seen most good companies that I know of do this very, very clearly. Stepping into engineering management is always a choice. It's never enforced. And it's a choice without trade-offs. It's not like if you want to grow, you must become a manager. If that's the choice, then that's not a choice really. At that point, you're forcing somebody to do that. So at Zendrive, for example, sort of, we have until a certain level, sort of, everything is the same. Like you are a senior engineer, then you are a senior engineer. At which point, you have a choice really to say, hey, I have an inclination, I'm enjoying this leadership thing, and I really want to take it a step further and really become an engineering manager, because that's where I think I will do my best work. Then that's where you gravitate towards. But if that's not your cup of tea, you can continue to be an individual contributor, and you can go and become a staff engineer, become a principal engineer, right? Where there is zero expectations of people management. There is all the expectation of technical leadership. You are going to be someone who is looking at the sort of, the, let's say, the technical roadmap, let's say
Correct.
say you are looking at systems and backend
Yeah, it
systems,
could
and
be
you
maybe an
are
architecture,
absolutely, you are
doing
going to
things
be
like that.
responsible for that architecture. You are going to be responsible for thinking about sort of, if I'm making these choices, high level choices, how do they impact the future of Zendrive in the next 2 years to come? Right?
Correct.
That kind of decision you have to make because you are senior enough. Even as an individual contributor, as a principal engineer, you have to make that decision. But you don't have to worry about the individuals within the team or the people and sort of their growth and their incentives and sort of their
Correct.
career progression and all of that. That is a manager's job, and it
Correct.
requires a very different breed of people
Correct.
one to another, and you cannot force one into another. You have to let people choose which direction they want without jeopardizing their career or their growth. Hey, both paths are equally valid. You can grow in any one of those. It's a choice that you have in terms of what you want to take on. And I think that's the right way of doing it.
Correct. Makes sense. And something else which is again on the same lines is, right, when someone kind of like takes, let's say they take the technical leadership route, how do you then kind of pull them into the overall picture, right? There's interacting with customers, there are business requirements. Sometimes, so what I've observed is, whenever I've seen this in action, usually the people who take that route tend to get a little more isolated, because they tend to become like this guru in this one area, saying, okay, I'm the best guy you can come to for this specific problem. How do you then pull them back in? Maybe not to manage, but how do you kind of bring in that sense of, I would say, ownership in a way to the overall business goals that the whole company has, right? How do you kind of like create that alignment? Would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. On a related note, I mean, there are various different functions, right? Customer success, sales, marketing, product, God knows how many more, right? How do you get these guys to kind of overlap meaningfully with all of those functions?
Correct.
Sure. I think those are two separate questions. I'll take those
Sure.
one by one, probably. So on the first one, Augustus, that you asked, yes, there is that potential danger of sort of, somebody who is an individual contributor becoming siloed, right? And I think to some extent it is a conscious choice also to sort of be, you are a more depth kind of a person at that point in time, right? You have, but then the company needs you for that depth, right? So let's take as an example for Zendrive, right? uh, because we work in sort of risk modeling kind of area quite a bit. There is a strong need at Zendrive for someone to be deeply interested and deeply understanding of how statistical modeling is done. For Zendrive, there is that that need, and you need people sort of so we have sort of someone who is a principal data scientist who is absolutely a specialist when it comes to sort of statistical modeling and risk modeling kind of stuff. And yes, in some ways, sort of that specialization is a choice, right? You don't expect a person with that kind of a aptitude and caliber to say, oh, they will be able to span sort of be more horizontal, look at all different types of customer questions and all of that also. But when there is a question about a customer around risk modeling and insurance piece, yes, you bring them in because that's the big gun that you have got, right? And you bring them to the table, you put them in front of customers so that they can understand, you can educate them about why what approach that you have is the absolute right thing to do, and how you distinguish yourself from the competition and so on, right? So it does not mean that this person is isolated, that they are just doing sort of in their own cocoon, they're doing something. They have exposure, it's just that their exposure is to a slightly more specialized sort of domain, because that's what they chose to do. And in some ways, sort of a diverse team is composed of people that has all of these capabilities, people who are very versatile, and people who are very specific but have tremendous amount of depth, right? And when all of these people work together in unison, that's when sort of, magic happens and sort of, you achieve greater things. So yeah, I think it's a question of, having that fundamental respect for sort of, everyone in the organization as to who they are, what they bring to the table, and having an appreciation for that, saying, yes, that is as important as this thing. And so, together we make it successful. Okay. Roshan, you had another question, and I remember roughly that, but I would I would not hazard sort of, guessing it. Maybe you can ask that question again, and I'll.
Yeah. No, you might have covered a bit of it. So my question was, how do you get engineering teams to meaningfully overlap with, let's say, customer success, sales, product, marketing, right? In SaaS, we have this whole company calendar funda where product and marketing run in one sort of calendar, and then sales and finance run in one calendar, and you try to sort of offset their cycles, but then they do sort of overlap on some key things, right? And you have all of these guys running towards a common milestone or a goal or as such, right? So in your opinion, how do you get your engineer at any different level of hierarchy he or she may be, right, to sort of meaningfully understand enough about all of these adjacent functions?
Sure. So one thing that we instituted several years ago, probably 4 years ago now, at Zendrive, is we started following OKR process. Right? OKR is objectives and key results process that companies like Google pretty much pioneered, sort of, so every quarter as a company, we set sort of, our objectives and key results across at the highest level for the company. Like, these are the things that we are working towards. These are the key things we'll measure ourselves by. And then every team sort of, takes that and distills it down to saying, in their function, within their group, within their organizational, area, how does that translate? What does it mean, right? So if there is a goal to sort of, go after a certain type of customer or enable a certain functionality, then sort of, it translates into product, it translates into engineering, it translates into marketing because they have to create the right collateral. It translates to sales because the next quarter they are going to sort of, take whatever is built and sort of, well, not next quarter, they have to start selling upfront even before sometimes the product is built, so that they are getting that kind of an input and priming the market for that. So in some ways, the OKR process serves two purposes. One is prioritization in terms of sort of what the company is going to do, measurability in that to say what is being done, how it is being done, and what is the outcome. But it also brings a strong sense of alignment across the board, because now you know what the company's goals are and how I am attached to that. And you also recognize how those different ties are, right? So at the time of, let's say, the OKR definition process, we have things like, hey, customer success has a certain requirements or expectations because they have collected over time, sort of, through the last quarters, a bunch of things that the customer expects or needs or wants based off of service tickets that have come up. So at the time of OKR definition, they'll come up and say, here are the things that have come up. Here is our prioritization of which ones are more important from a customer's perspective, which ones are less important. Which one of these can be and should be done in the coming quarter to sort of, to knock it out. And then engineering and product will look at their own sort of, prioritization, be able to look at and say, this is the estimation for these things. This is what can be done and cannot be done. So that's sort of, a level where you start bringing in these two teams to talk to each other and say, this is what and all of it always is in the service of customer, right? So there isn't a question of anything like an us versus them. It's always a question of, hey, we are on the same side. We are trying to serve the customer. And we're just bringing in different pieces of information that together, when they are there, they allow us to serve the customer better. Right? So the OKR process definitely is one tool that kind of helps. Others are sort of, things that, creating, again, channels of communication or interaction. Right? So for example, at Zendrive, we do a product council. every 2 weeks, where the idea again is for different stakeholders to come together at that council, bring in their questions, rapid decision making, and then sort of disperse and move on from there, right? So sales is there, marketing is there, customer success is there, engineering and product are there, and then sort of things that bubble up that are important enough get talked about, get discussed, and either triaged in terms of, yes, this is being done, here is a prioritization for this, or this is not being done, here is why it need not be taken up right now. So having those kinds of mechanisms help, and then you have to build in some ways bridges at multiple levels, right? There are bridges at the leadership level. So for example, if I am the engineering lead, I'm making sure that I'm talking to the customer success lead on a very ongoing basis. So sort of anything that bubbles up to any of us, we are always talking and engaging. But there is also engagement down to sort of the guy who is doing the support tickets for one of the products, and the product manager for that, and the QA lead for that. So that sort of when those tickets and issues come up, QA is able to quickly verify and say whether those actually make sense, whether those are right, whether those need to be handled, and then product manager is able to make a call and say, hey, this thing requires us to do a emergency push or a cherry pick release, and that's what we must do, versus what, this one is a lower priority, or the impact, the severity of the whole thing is less, so we have more time to sort of handle this kind of a thing. So you have to build these bridges at multiple levels in some ways, and always sort of things that it boils down to is, how do people feel sort of within the organization? Do they feel like they are together solving a problem for the customer? And if they do that, then these things work more effortlessly and more efficiently.
Right. So you've hired tens, if not hundreds, of engineers in your career, right? What are some things that have worked for you in terms of finding the right person for the job?
I think the most important thing I would say is, skills can be learned, attitudes are hard to change, right? So if I find somebody who is a strong cultural fit and there is a small gap here and there in the skill set, I would rather hire that person as opposed to looking for somebody who is an absolute perfect fit, but will be a misfit, absolute perfect fit from a skill perspective, but will be a misfit in the organization from a culture and attitude perspective. So that's we do sort of a culture fit kind of an interview at Zendrive. Typically, a hiring manager would always be involved in doing that, and the expectation is that if that interview does not give the right signal, then we are not hiring that person, even if he or she has been found to be technically brilliant. Right? Apart from that, sort of the standard things that sort of everybody would sort of attest to, which is know what you're hiring for. Right? This is one of the common things that people make a mistake very early on, where you're looking for a unicorn, right? That doesn't exist, and then sort of knowing, hey, this is what the job requires, this is what the skill set is, or this is what the job description is. So having that job description more accurately defined, I think, makes hiring that much easier. If you're thinking from a startup perspective, this does not necessarily apply to some of the big companies that I worked at, but at startup, I can certainly say, if there are people who have, and there's nothing wrong or right about this, it's just that people have inclination. Some people are more, have a lot more bias towards being in a stable position, right? They crave for stability. Then maybe startups, and particularly early stage startups, are not sort of for them. So everything else might check out, but then this person will be a continuous sort of anxious looking person in the team who is always worried about things, and that's not necessarily healthy for the group as well. In my perspective, I would always look for slightly junior but more hungry individuals than somebody who checks all the boxes but is kind of more been there, done that kind of an attitude, right? So person who has that thing, like yeah, I'm given more responsibility and I can take that on and I can learn, and I'm being given a little bit of a freedom to sort of, do not so great at times, because people are going to make mistakes when they're junior as well, right? uh, Having that entrepreneurial bend of mind where people want to take that bet, want to try different things, again, going back to our things we talked about, what makes a good engineer. So those are things that sort of are equally valid for me. From a process hiring process perspective, one thing I would say is obsess about the candidate experience. It matters a lot. When people come in for interview, they are also interviewing you, right? It's
Yeah.
not just that you are interviewing them, which means how they feel about the company is going to matter a lot in the eventual decision. So being professional, being friendly, being punctual, uh, providing right kind of feedback, preparing candidates. Sometimes the thing becomes like, hey, we are interviewing, so we are just judging you. No, that's not how it has to be. It has to be about how are you preparing this candidate for the next interview, right? So maybe sort of, the recruiter or the hiring manager sometimes should give a deeper insight into, hey, this is how our process works. These are the 3 rounds of interviews that we do. First round, you will be asked these kinds of things. Second round will focus on this. Third will focus on this. And answer as many questions as candidate has about those kind of things, because that can help the candidate be better prepared. You are not going to ask that person sort of, when they are on the job also to say, okay, right now tell me the answer. If you can't tell the answer in the next hour, you're fired. That's not going to happen, right? You're going to give them time to understand, time to, marinate with the problem and be able to solve that, right? So give that sort of, thing during the interview as well. Give them that early exposure, help them prepare. And if they do great, then, absolutely hire them. Um, yeah, so those are some of the things that we try to do and sort of work well for us. We found internships to be a great way of hiring. Hire interns, more of them if you can. They bring a lot of good energy, a lot of fresh blood, enthusiasm to the thing. But some of our best hires are people who interned with us and continue to work with us for a long period of time after that. So it's a great way to sort of try before you buy, and sort of really get going from there.
Fantastic. So, Pankaj, this has been a fascinating chat. We've covered many different aspects of engineering leadership, and how you should structure teams, so on and so forth. So, before we end the podcast, your final thoughts on, perhaps, advice to founders on how they should work with their engineering leaders.
Founders, how they should work with their engineering leaders.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, I think it's both ways. So I'll tell you both sides of the story. Right? So yeah, I think again you have to understand the psychology of both sides, right? That the founder is coming from a place where they have started this company. It's their baby, right? And you know the only thing that matters to them is how is this thing going to become sort of big, large, successful through whatever metrics that they have defined as sort of success for them, right? But and so from that perspective, if you come, what they are looking for is they are ready to partner. It doesn't matter with sort of what level in the organization someone is. They're always looking for frank and honest opinion, because that's all matters. There is no scope for sugarcoating things or politics, or sort of being sort of I don't know what's the right word here, but being polite about things at times, right? I mean, it's more about say it like it is, right? As a founder, I would like to sort of hear from people whatever it is, give me straight up, because that's what matters to me, right? And I've actually found in many ways engineers have the same sort of attitude towards things also. They they whatever piece of code software that they're writing, in some ways it's their baby, right? They think of it as sort of something, but the intention always is to make it better, to make it improve, to make sure it is useful and usable by others, right? And so whatever feedback that as a founder I would give to anybody is always about the output that they have delivered, not about them. This is a big distinction in some ways, right? You're never giving feedback about the person. The person is what it is. You're giving feedback about the output that they've produced. Maybe software has bugs. The person doesn't have bugs, right? And then if you keep it at that sort of level of feedback, because then it can be objective. Then you can have a meaningful conversation, keeping egos completely outside, keeping emotions completely outside, and then focus on the specific problem at hand and trying to solve that problem. Then the best outcomes get achieved. And so yeah, in that sense, it's the same from sort of both sides, whether it is talking to founders or founders talking to engineers. It's really keep it focused a lot more on the specific product, right? From an expectation perspective, as a founder, I want the people that are working with me or that are being part of my organization, or when they are talking to me or when they are presenting to me, to be absolutely open and honest. And I would like to do exactly the same thing for them, because that's when the maximum impact gets created. Creating a startup, being entrepreneur is a bold step, in some ways that you have already taken. And you want the people that are working for you and with you to do the same thing, right? To be bold in whatever decision that they are making, to lay out the risk and rewards clearly, to understand where it makes sense to take risks, where it doesn't, to articulate decisions very carefully, to sort of be data driven, to have opinions but have them loosely held, be open, understand when there is a likelihood of failure, call that out, and when something fails, own it up. It's far better to say, hey, we tried this and it failed, than to sort of sugarcoat it and say, yeah, we did this, we did that, this one was kind of... No, let's just say it, right? It didn't work. Okay, here is what we learned from it, and here is how we are going to change our path from going forward from here onwards, right? So that kind of openness, honesty, and straightforward communication, I think, is what I as a founder expect, and I as a founder intend to provide to every engineer and every engineering lead that I work with.
Amazing. So that's a great note to end the podcast on, Pankaj. Really appreciate your spending time on the podcast, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks,
Absolutely.
Pankaj.
Thank you so much, guys. It was absolutely a blast talking to you and just exchanging ideas about what startup like, what's engineering and engineering leadership like. So,
yeah, entirely our pleasure. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.